What's good? It's Wood. A quick analysis on the championship rematch between champion Stipe Miocic and Francis Ngannou. Stipe had defended his title versus Ngannou a few years ago, and he won via 5-round unanimous decision. So going into this, the idea is that going into their first fight, Francis Ngannou was just taking people's heads off. First-round knockouts over Andrei Arlovski, and of course, the vicious, sensational uppercut knockout of Alistair Overeem going into his first title challenge. This is Ngannou going in against the champ Stipe. Now, Stipe was kicking a lot of butt, won the title versus Fabricio Werdum, and then defended it successfully a couple times. And then takes on the challenger who everybody was just seeing decapitate all of his opponents with this, unforeseen power. I've never seen power like this in the heavyweight division. Perhaps Fedor Emelianenko comes close, but I'm just talking about the ability to just dust somebody and get them out of there by connecting with one punch. And the otherwise super green kind of newcomer to mixed martial arts, you could read up on his story, Francis Ngannou, comes in with Stipe with essentially a puncher's chance, but a hell of a puncher's chance. And he actually connected with Stipe a couple times early, and Stipe hung on, took him down, and basically the rest of the fight, the story of the fight, was Stipe taking Ngannou down without getting too badly hurt, and then keeping him down throughout the 5 rounds, and wearing Ngannou down to the point where in between one of the rounds or after one of the rounds, Ngannou could barely get up and walk back to his corner. He looked that fatigued. So since their first fight, the question is, what's gone different with both of these guys? Well, in the case of Stipe, his only 3 fights since defending successfully versus Ngannou were the trilogy fights versus Daniel Cormier. The first, Stipe got knocked out and lost the title. He stopped DC in the 4th of their rematch and then won a 5-round decision versus DC in the rubber match. So he comes out of the 3 fights with the title, and Ngannou, much like his fights prior to losing to Stipe, he was scoring a bunch of first-round knockouts. After losing to Stipe, he has the one fight versus Derrick Lewis where it was essentially a 3-round stalemate, very little activity, one of the most disappointing and anticlimactic fights we've seen in the UFC, especially given the hype and given the intrigue and the excitement around this fight going in. You've got Derrick Lewis and Francis Ngannou, 2 of the deadliest punchers we've ever seen in the heavyweight division, locking horns. Well, it ended up being a stalemate where both guys were reluctant to make their moves. They awarded Derrick Lewis with the decision, largely via a few leg kicks and just doing just enough to do more than Ngannou was doing, which upon first glance looked like next to nothing. This was, again, one of the most boring fights I can recall watching in the UFC. So there was that aberration of a fight for Ngannou. But since then, he has knocked out in succession Curtis Blades for the 2nd time. He knocked out Cain Velasquez, Junior Dos Santos, and Jairzinho Rozenstruik. And these were all first-round knockouts. So it's like, if you're looking to see if Francis Ngannou shored up the parts of his game that were lacking and that allowed Stipe to exploit his lack of endurance, his lack of takedown defense, and these different skills, well, we just don't have the evidence that has been done. Now, we could hear that in the gym he's been working on this stuff, and he could tell us that he has corrected these flaws in his game. We could either take his word for it or we can't. But in terms of in-cage performance in fights, we have yet to see it. Again, largely because he was doing the same thing he was doing before the Stipe fight, which is getting all of his opponents out of there in the first round with his vicious punching power and punching speed. We can't discount that. And actually, that is what's going to lead me into who I'm going with in this fight. Now, again, we just said that he hasn't shown that he's corrected these parts of his game, he being Francis Ngannou. But what's the other thing that has happened since their first fight? I would say simply the passage of time. It's a difference between getting a 36-year-old Stipe in there and basically a 40 or 39-year-old, 40-year-old Stipe in there. And we don't know where Stipe's total game is, because when you have a trilogy fight, and this wasn't a trilogy fight where it's like you fight the guy, fight a couple other guys, come back, fight that guy again, then go out and fight another guy or another couple guys, and then come back and fight the guy again. No. This was 3 consecutive fights with another 40-year-old who wasn't, who had beaten Derrick Lewis, to his credit, before fighting the second and third fight versus Stipe. So DC got that Lewis fight in there between Stipe 1 and Stipe 2, but Stipe fought once in 2018 versus DC, once in 2019 versus DC, and once in 2020 versus DC. So he hasn't tested his skills against any of this new crop of heavyweights. We haven't seen Stipe in there with Rosenstruck, with Cyril Gane, who's just ascending up the rankings right now. Cyril Gane. We haven't seen him in there with Curtis Blades. We haven't seen him in there with Derrick Lewis, Alexander Volkov, you name it. The guys that we have seen him beating were the old guys in the division who just stuck around for a very long time. I'm talking Fabricio Verdum, Junior Dos Santos, Alistair Overeem, Andrei Arlovsky. Well, when your last 3 fights have all been against the same 40-year-old, we just don't know how your 40-year-old Stipe, 40-year-old skill set will then line up against a Curtis Blades, or in this case, rematching Francis Ngannou, whose speed is really good. And for Stipe to beat Francis, I don't think he's going to outbox him over the course of 3 rounds. No, I think that he would be best served doing what he tried to do the first time, and he did so successfully, which is don't allow this to become a punch-for-punch style of fight. And look, Stipe is about as gifted a boxing MMA guy as you'll get. He outboxed Roy Nelson, and he's largely outboxed, he outboxed DC, Daniel Cormier, in a lot of ways, and he's outboxed several others. That's why he, before losing the title against DC, he was the first UFC heavyweight champ to successfully defend his title 3 times. So he's been beating everybody but DC. Stefan Struve beat him a long time ago, and Junior Dos Santos beat him, I think, via decision a long, long time ago. I'd have to double check that second one. But Stipe rarely loses, but Francis Ngannou is not your typical opponent. Again, we've never seen a fighter with this type of punching power. You could argue maybe Derrick Lewis, but, I'd have to see somebody just take one guy after the next, and just demolish them in the way that Francis has done so. This guy is just incinerating opponents with the touch of his hand. And so, no, I don't think that Stipe wants to stand up and trade and box with this guy. Here's the thing. Wrestling is a very young man's sport. If you look at, the wrestlers who then went into MMA and then into the UFC, look at Yoel Romero, look at Daniel Cormier, look at Ben Askren, look at all these guys. You watch how they moved when they were wrestling. This is collegiate wrestling, right? On an elite level. The way that their bodies move and what's required to properly wrestle is so exhausting. I mean, this is why the high school and college matches are so short minutes-wise in wrestling. It's because it is simply an exhausting sport, minute for minute, to take somebody's body weight, take somebody down and then control them on the ground. That's why you see even great UFC wrestlers, Rampage Jackson, Jon Jones, Rashad Evans, Justin Gaethje, Yoel Romero, even Daniel Cormier. You see these guys use their wrestling less and less and less as they get into their 30s and then into their mid-30s and then obviously into their late 30s. Wrestling is simply too exhausting minute for minute to where it just isn't it's usually not an employable strategy over the course of 3 rounds, let alone 5 rounds. You could get away maybe doing it for 3, but we saw Curtis Blades try to do it against Volkov and start wrestling early. He was holding on to win that decision victory by the end of the 5th round. It's just too much to ask, wrestling somebody for 20 to 25 rounds. Now, we did just see it versus, in Derek Brunson's fight versus Kevin Holland, but again, it requires your opponent to be green and to really not know what he's doing in terms of takedown defense and in terms of getting back up. Otherwise, if you're up against a guy who's not making it easy for you to control them, and you're suffering, some arm fatigue, just core fatigue, you're going to start getting too drained to then stand back up if you can't control the guy and the guy gets back up and wants to engage in a kickboxing match to really engage effectively. You just expended too much trying to control this guy's body. So at 40 versus 36 years old, I just don't know that, one, Stipe can engage Francis in the moments of the stand-up without getting cracked by this guy who, again, is not only ultra powerful, but does have some hand speed. He leaves his chin out there a little bit. You can look at his finishing combination over Jarzinho Rosenstruck and see that, he was wildly throwing that 1, 2, 3, and his chin was out there. And he was missing a lot too. But when he connects, it's all over. Now, Stipe is more defensive and more skilled than some of the guys who've been blasted by Ngannou. But again, he's fought nobody but Daniel Cormier for the past 3 to 4 years, to where I just don't know if this old dog is still keeping up with the speed and some of the energy that a younger fighter might possess that Daniel Cormier at that stage of his career just didn't. So I am placing the higher likelihood in terms of how this fight's going to play out, and I'm looking at the slim margin for error that Stipe has. Look, if Stipe takes him down in the first, you still got to contend with Francis in the beginning of the second. And unless his cardio is complete trash and he's like basically defanged and harmless after the first couple rounds, it's going to be very difficult for Stipe to swim without getting wet in this one. Because, again, if he's going to try to take Francis down and control him, even if Francis has improved a little bit in his takedown defense and a little bit in his ability to perhaps get up once he is taken down. Now, we don't know these things again, but we could assume that he's been working on them. So if he's a little bit better at that, and if Stipe is a little bit less enduring, even though we just saw him go 5 more rounds in his last fight with Daniel Cormier, something that Francis, the only 5-rounder Francis has been in, was that loss to Stipe. There are a lot of reasons to go Stipe here, but because of his age, because of the trilogy with Daniel Cormier and the attrition and the toll that could take on a fighter, especially, again, between the ages of 36 and 40, you basically have him going in against a much, much fresher and still less tested, because we haven't seen Francis in these drag him out, go to the ground, back up, go to the ground, take a beating, keep on ticking. Like, we haven't seen Francis in these scenarios, so maybe he does get exposed a second time versus Stipe. I just think that he's going to connect with Stipe and be able to finish him, because the margin for error here is so slim, and I don't think that we could just assume that with the passage of time that Stipe has retained all of the endurance and wrestling over the course of several rounds abilities that he had at 36 years old. We'll see how that goes. But I'm actually going to go Francis via first or second round KO, TKO, stoppage. Shoot, you know what would be very interesting is if Stipe, and this is very possible, if he submits Ngannou, like chokes him out or something. That would be interesting. A 5-round win would be interesting too, just to see somebody tame the lion and defang them over the course of 5 rounds. But also, if Stipe is able to score a knockout TKO of his own over Francis Ngannou, I think that that's a very underlooked or overlooked possibility here, because Stipe has finished a lot of opponents, including Daniel Cormier. But yeah, I'm still taking Francis Ngannou over Stipe in this one for the reasons I just mentioned. But yeah, let me know your thoughts on this fight. Let me know your thoughts on the outlook in the heavyweight division. What do you think the insertion of Jones into the heavyweight division is going to look like, depending on whether Stipe wins or if Francis wins? And who are you picking in this one? Also, how do you think Jon Jones would fare versus Derrick Lewis or Curtis Blades? Please leave your comments in the comments, like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.